3:30, and we might as well go ahead and get started. First off, I want to welcome all of you and thank you for coming to the first CHSS event of the spring semester. This event is a continuation of a couple of things that we were doing last semester, continuing our series of crisis and social change and making social change, and continuing the questions about politics in a time of crisis. So the goal of CHSS in general is to bring together scholars across departments and disciplines and centers, and to help show the way that the humanities and social sciences can contribute to sustaining our communities and solving critical social problems, especially in a time of crisis. And so our event today is an attempt to basically, from a historical perspective, figure out, well, what just happened in these elections of 2020, and think about where we are now, having gone through this rather tumultuous election season, and what might the next steps look like going forward. And so we have a very distinguished panel of historians who have all written about elections and political figures in one way or the other, in a variety of different ways. Our moderator will be Mark Kornbluh, who is the author of Why America Stopped Voting: The Decline of Participatory Democracy and the Emergence of Modern American Politics. A very critical topic for our discussion today. The panelists will be Tracy Campbell, who is the author of Deliver the Vote, A History of Election Fraud, an American Political Tradition, and Short of the Glory, The Fall and Rise of Edward Pritchard, and these and other books as well, but those are the ones that are specifically about elections. Anastasia Curwood is the author of a much-awaited forthcoming book on Shirley Chisholm, who ran for president in 1972. And it's called Chisholm, The Life of an American Symbol. So again, I want to welcome our wonderful panelists. I want to welcome the audience, and I'll turn things over to Mark.
Thanks so much, Karen. And maybe you could bring the perspective of a Russian historian to this topic as well. There's really so much to talk about. The political world has been transformed since November 3rd. When we originally thought about doing this panel, we planned to look back on the 2020 election. But in many ways, what's happened since has been as important as what happened on November 3rd. So we're historians, so we like to do things chronologically. So today we're gonna look at the elections first and talk about the Georgia runoffs, examine President Trump's rejection of the results and the invasion of the Capitol, and then look at where we stand today, what the division of the Republican Party, and then we'll all skate out on thin ice because historians hate to predict the future, but we'll talk about, you know, what may be coming in the recent months. So let's get started. It seems a lifetime ago that the 2020 election occurred, but Tracy, why don't I start with you? What were your immediate takeaways? 10 weeks later, how does it feel to you? Does it feel the same? Has the interim changed your views?
Things have changed because this is one election in which weeks afterwards are probably more important than the weeks leading up to it because of the events of January 6th. So I'm still trying to understand that as well. But looking at the election, you know, Mark, your book was Why Americans Stopped Voting. Well, they voted on November 3rd, even in the midst of a pandemic, and it went off really without a hitch in most places. Comparatively speaking, Biden won a pretty easy election. When George W. Bush won, I did some homework. When Bush won 286 electoral votes in 2004, he said, I've got some political capital. I'm ready to spend it now. So Biden, it seems, has even more money to invest if that's the case. It's in terms of the popular vote, this is 7 out of 8 elections now that Democrats have won since 1992. One last thing about Biden, he won 51.4% of the popular vote. When Ronald Reagan won his landslide in 1980, he won 50.4%. The last president who won more against an incumbent was actually Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 when he beat Herbert Hoover. it's kind of hard to beat an incumbent. It's only been done 10 times in American history. So this was a remarkable victory for Joe Biden. We, of course, found out a few weeks ago that the Senate will be split 50-50, which is enormously interesting. And it changes every hour about the dynamics of that. The House, the Republicans did rather well on the same ballot that they're not happy about with when it comes to Biden. So those were my immediate takeaways.
Anastasia?
Yeah, at first I want to say it's good to be here, and the title of my book has changed since my last bio was written. It is now Aim High, Shirley Chisholm and Black Feminist Power. So that's how that's how the press has it right now. But right after that, the election was called in November. My immediate response was frankly relief and gratitude to voters, especially Black voters and first-time voters. I was delighted to see the first Black and South Asian woman in the White House. But I was also wary. I was wary about these intervening 10 weeks, which seems like a lifetime to me, and I think to many people, because I was quite wary about the prospects for a successful transition of power. Because of the anti-democratic actions that had occurred and the anti-democratic rhetoric that was occurring. In short, I feared that the incumbent would attempt a coup, like many Americans, and we were right.
Well, so that's interesting. So, one of my big takeaways is I never imagined democracy was as shallow and at risk in this country as it was. So, I think that, I found it quite shocking to see how many political leaders would take expediency over evidence, over fact, and over democratic results. I think, Tracy, you said that what happened since November 3rd is just as important. Obviously, it's really important. But my other big takeaway from this is, damn, the presidency matters. I mean, democracy really works. I mean, if you look at all the things Biden has done in 1 week, this vote worked. This is a resounding success, even if it is much more shallow and precarious than we ever imagined it in ways. The presidency seems to have gained, has always been powerful, but, probably never more so than in recent years with Congress so deadlocked. And the president, makes policy and enforces policy now. So how do we understand, what accounts for Biden's strong victory? I think Anastasia and I both agree with you, Tracy, that, that historically this is a really, really impressive victory in terms of percentages, in terms of, proportion of the country in an electoral system that's stacked the other way in many cases. So how do we understand that?
You want me to start? To me, this election was a referendum on Donald Trump. I don't know what else to say. To me, everything was colored by COVID, the crisis of COVID, and the kind of appalling reaction to COVID from a national standpoint since February and March. And so I didn't see it in any really other way than a referendum, really, on the sitting president who ran a really lackluster campaign, just, I don't know, thinking that it was in the bag. I don't know, but the groundwork for this was built in 2016 when he said it was rigged. And he was kind of like Citizen Kane, who had two newspapers ready to go, you know, either Kane wins or fraud at the polls, and he's covered both ways. And so when he won on election night in 2016, the whole notion of rigged went away. It was like, we're all good here. But if there is a nefarious group of people in some room somewhere rigging this, you would think that that would be kind of a national drive to find out who these people were and how they're doing it. Instead, and it's interesting to me, Mark, that elected officials who are elected are saying that this person is elected, has certain credibility, but this person I don't recognize, even though they might be on the same ballot I was on, is a dangerous concept. As we've seen, this is not how democracy is supposed to work.
Yeah, I agree with Tracy. I really do think it was a referendum on Trump, and COVID was absolutely the biggest part of that. I also, though, want to point out that even though there are large millions of Americans who feel that Trump had to go, that Biden's victory was by no means preordained or would naturally happen. So I understand Biden's strong victory as an achievement of organizing by national and local activists. Black voters in particular. I'm an African Americanist historian, and so I have seen this happen over the decades. This is no exception, that Black voters, also progressive voters, mobilized very strategically. And I think that the Democratic National Committee was not caught sleeping as badly as it had been earlier, and did not take anything for granted, especially in those key swing states, the formerly named Blue Wall that fell in 2016. And I do think that organizing was energized by people's treatment under Trump, the treatment of American citizens. I actually think about this in the sense that for the first time, many Americans experienced what it was like to live as a Black American. That is, to have imminent physical danger, no financial safety net, the threat of losing health care, the feeling of political disenfranchisement, and then last but certainly not least, the visible crimes and visible ethical violations done by the highest levels in presidential power, and the lack of consequences for those actions. That deeply resonates, especially for those who have experienced Jim Crow and its aftermath, the aftermath of slavery. That watching that kind of impunity and being unable to do anything about it is a very familiar experience for Black Americans.
So a social science way to put this is to remind people that voting is both collective action and individual choice. And so Anastasia, you're focusing on the real hard work of collective action that went into this in Georgia and Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, that made a really big difference in those places. And probably fair to say that, the activism of the Cuban community and Venezuelan community in Florida turned Florida out for Trump as well. So that were mobilized around very different issues. So
indeed, and we can talk about Florida's race in a few minutes.
Yeah. So a referendum on Trump does that explain why the Democrats won what's clearly a very strong victory in the presidency, but lost ground in the House and didn't do as well in the Senate as they originally had hoped? Tracy, what do you think?
Probably, but these districts are so gerrymandered now that they're so tilted in one way or the other. I don't think you can make that kind of statement about House races. The only national race we have is for president. And you kind of can see the larger picture there when it comes to local races. But, if I could get back to Georgia, where, Stacey Abrams is a genius, and I don't think people had their eye on Georgia, at least from various standpoints, but I didn't think it was a coincidence that Trump was focused on Georgia afterwards, because it has a long history of delegitimizing Black votes. So many Supreme Court cases about, one person, one vote usually originates from Georgia, which had this thing called a county unit system, so that you could get elected governor without winning the most votes, just rack up the most county units, so that would give rural voters and mostly white voters a lot more clout than, say, voters in Atlanta. But, to me, if there's one thing I did that, historians have to do in looking at evidence, I have read Trump's speech that he gave on January 6th. Has anyone else done that? I mean, it's like an hour of your life you're not going to get back. But if this is the impeachable speech, I wanted to see what he said. And I might down the road make it required reading, since this probably is his defining speech, in which he says, if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win. If Mike Pence does the right thing, we win. I mean, think about the consequences of that. If he, according to Louis Gohmert, another House member who had filed suit, said if he's not some quote unquote glorified envelope opener, well, yeah, he kind of is really, but if that's the case, then what's the point of the vote of the Electoral College or any of this, if the vice president can simply say we count these votes and not these other ones? And one last thing, just to give you an idea of how bizarre that speech was, but it's also telling. He says, and I quote, and I had Brian Kemp, who weighs 130 pounds. He said he played offensive line in football. I'm still don't know about that. So he goes off to talk about how Brian Kemp is small in stature. So apparently he's not, doesn't have the masculine qualities that's necessary to be a real leader, and that's essential to his speech that day on January 6th. So you told me to be the pessimist in this group early on, Mark. So that's why I bring up notions like we need to actually look at that speech and look at what was said to the Secretary of State of Georgia, in which, to me, that was the most telling one of all. It's not, let's find out what happened in Georgia. Let's see, about these nefarious groups. It's find me 11,341 more votes. Find me one more than they have. I get one more, I win, we close the door. And that is the most perfect example of what I call count till you win, that Boss Tweed wouldn't even have said, right?
He might have done, but it wouldn't.
He would have done it, but he didn't have to say it quite that openly. Right? Find me just one more. And we know what find means.
But since we're jumping ahead here, but one of the most interesting things that happened is none of these local officials in any of these states were willing to play ball, right? So, Georgian Republicans none of them would go along. They wouldn't go along in Michigan. They wouldn't go along in Wisconsin. So how do we understand that?
I was going to talk about gerrymandering, but
sure.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, and I guess what I was thinking about in response to your original question dovetails with this a little bit, which is that while the question was about the House, why the House didn't do as well as the presidential election, and I absolutely agree that it's gerrymandering. I also want to add that even though the lawlessness and criminality of Trump and abdication of the COVID issue of Trump really appeared to have been electorally a losing strategy for him, the American voters might have repudiated him, but not the policies on the right and some of the policies of the far right that much of the GOP is still advocating for. So while we had it appears that not all of the GOP has endorsed Trump's behavior, but they still have the policy interests. And so some of them appear to have wanted to remain true to their policy and still be Republicans, but repudiate him. The other thing is that although Republican voter turnout is pretty amazing, that it was 2018 was an off year, and it was that election, that 2-year election after the presidential election, in which that party oftentimes loses seats, and Democratic people voting for Democrats have been incredibly energized for that election and for this election, this most recent election. But Republican voters turned out in droves in this election, and so some of those folks who had slid into the House didn't make it this time.
Yeah. So we have a comment from an attendee that said, gerrymandering, suppose Democrats never did that. So Tracy is an expert on this, right? Both parties play with the rules all the time. But to my mind, one of the things that's been really striking is in the last decade, we've seen more and more moving around the rules to in undemocratic ways, right? So it's not just, the very consciously ways to disqualify voters on one side and to redistrict people so that votes don't really count.
Right.
Yeah.
We could play this game all day long about, what have people done in the past, but what I meant by gerrymandering, I didn't necessarily think it was a negative comment. I thought it was simply a notion that we have districts that are really weighed in one way or the other, and they're not going to move that much is really the point. It's not that it's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. It's kind of like the filibuster. It's where you stand and when you do the counting and where you stand on that issue. So, I'm ready to move on if you are.
Okay. So let's talk about the Georgia runoffs for a moment. So what accounts for the Democratic victories there, which were razor thin, and why does this matter so much for politics? Anastasia, you want to go first this time?
Sure. Yeah. So my answer is a bit similar to the answer I gave to your initial question about how did Biden do this, and it's organizing, and in this case, very conspicuously, it's Black women's organizing. We should remember that behind Abrams, who rightfully is getting credit for this massive organizing effort in the state, that there are grassroots Black women and men, and in fact a multiracial coalition of organizing. So this is knowing the terrain, knowing the turf, and squeezing every vote possible out of that turf. I found it amazing that even after the presidential election, several 100,000 more voters were registered, and so that they could vote in the runoff election. That's knowing your turf and knowing your strategy. But this speaks to a larger issue about change being possible in the rest of the South. So one of a fond refrain of many progressives across the nation, particularly in the North and West, is that, well, why doesn't the South secede again? Or you know, that bad state, whatever, Alabama, Kentucky, Florida, you know, why they're holding back the rest of the country because they're presumed to be red. Well, what actually we have in the South is we have a enthusiastic Republican electorate, but we also have deep reserves of suppressed votes that tend to go Democratic. And so when those votes are tapped into, change is possible. And it suggests that change is possible for the rest of the South. Bringing more voters in was the answer.
Tracy, you want to add anything?
The little number crunching that I've read said that at least in Georgia, among Trump supporters, those who were likely to support him were less likely to vote in those runoff elections because they were believing the theories that things were rigged. And so that was one of the unintended consequences of his actions afterwards. And that's why I think a number of Republican leaders were telling him to back off because it was actually hurting the case. So that's one of the interesting things about looking at politics are those unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I think Mitch McConnell's response after as well reflects that he thought that Trump's attitude over this hurt the Republican Party. On the other hand, you know, Georgia's had robust voter suppression, probably as much or more than any other state. So it took even more collective action to get those votes out than it would in Oregon, where you have, you know, election day voting and easy registration. So that you know, the demographics of Georgia are changing. People are moving back down there. So collective action there was, you know, was going up against a stiff wave, but was, you know, won a pretty solid victory, Warnock's victory in particular. But
Warnock has to run next year, I believe, for the full term. So that's next year. That's going to be winding up here soon. So he's going to have to pull this off again, and we'll see what how the dynamics play out in Georgia for next year.
So I didn't have this down as a question, but I'm going to catch you off guard here. So if there was lots of change in Georgia, there was very little change in Texas. We might leave Florida aside because the demographics are more unusual there, but in Texas and other places, the Democrats thought there would be change. Do you have an explanation for that?
No, but I know Anastasia does.
This is not my, I do not have the statistics in front of me, but I do want to acknowledge, actually, I think that there's a common thread through Florida and Texas and Arizona, which is Latinx voters. And there is, in Florida, yes, the expatriate communities organized, but I think we did underestimate, and I think we are underestimating the effects of Spanish language outreach to Latinx voters. There is a very robust platform that RT has set up, the Spanish language RT, that Latinx voters are paying attention to. And it's, I think, because so many of us don't read Spanish, we might not notice, oh, did you see this on this website? There's this disinformation occurring here, but I think Spanish language disinformation is a real problem. And so I think that it's the demographics and the targets for propaganda that we are seeing in those states.
So Tracy alluded to before sort of the machismo part of Trump's speech and talking about bigger and smaller and a very masculine language. And you know, the polls, the polling that took place on election day showed, I believe, the largest gender gap among Latinx voters, larger than among white and among Black voters as well. And so, but, you know, the Times has had several articles, you know, focusing on sort of the masculine nature of the Republican appeal and Trump's appeal as part of this story as well. Go on. I was going to say,
yeah. The joys of Zoom. Yeah, I think that the GOP had, but also Russian propagandists have identified Latinx voters, and especially given some of that history in Venezuela and in Cuba, I think that resonates. There are messages that resonate about fears of regime change and that we need to watch out for.
Before we leave Georgia completely, our colleague, Professor White, asked, do you think that the WNBA support for Reverend Warnock had an impact on the runoff?
That's a great question. I think the person asking it is probably better equipped to answer it than I am. Yeah, I think Warnock himself was a really good candidate, frankly. Being the pastor as he is of Ebenezer Baptist Church, being a gifted politician and speaker, but I think that WNBA adds some cool factor to his candidacy. So, but if he wasn't such a good candidate, I don't know if they would have done that anyway. That's my answer.
Well, didn't Loeffler also own part of the team? And
yes, yes.
Right. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
So I thought the Times had a long, fascinating article, was it last weekend, about the dog that showed up in Warnock's ads, and we did a lot of work on how hard the campaign worked to present him as less threatening, and you know what it takes to elect a Black man, you know, statewide in that way. And it turned out this dog, you know, was used in one commercial and was very, you know, then you know, really popular, and it was used repeatedly, and wasn't even his dog, and but yet you know, it was a way to present him that made disinformation more difficult to the public. All right, well, let's move on. So what about what about so many people refusing to accept the results of the election? Why? We understand why Trump did this. Why did so many people, did they really believe him? Why did they believe him?
You want to go first, Tracy?
Okay. Like I said, in 2016, he kind of laid the groundwork for this, that if I lose, it's not legit. And quite frankly, I don't know how many people really think that. Or it's just covered for they're not happy with the results. Which, you know, I think Coach Cal ought to say, I don't know why people are criticizing me. We're undefeated. And we've won every game. And, you know, I know there are some people who say that they didn't, but we say they did. I think we got to look at both sides here, right? because I think they're undefeated. That's a little absurd, but really, is it? Considering that, you know, federal judges looked at this from every angle. If there had been any evidence, they might have seized it, but one said that the whole point was risible. You know, I had to look that up to see if it's what I thought it meant, and it was that it's laughable. And, you know, we've got plenty of history of, you know, stealing votes, of vote suppression, of more people voting in precincts than existed in them, and none of that happened here. So I'm not sure it's the fact that they refused to accept the fact that they lost as much as something deeper. And that, so when you say stop the steal, what is being stolen? What is, you know, this sense of being entitled to, whether it's the presidency or something else, is actually there underneath it all. And that is really, to me, the story of this whole
thing. I think that's right, Tracy. So Trump is a successful demagogue, and what he does, and this is, the scholars of demagoguery have been saying this. So he presents complex problems as having simple solutions that are reducible to a tweet. He demonizes the political opposition, and he easily used our native brand of racism to generate and energize his base. And that he not only had help from the political party apparatus, but help from disinformation. So he's a successful demagogue following the script for demagogues and authoritarians. And the problem is that once they rise to power, it's very difficult to get them out of power. And I mean, he left it all on the floor. He fought hard to stay in power. And as for voters, for better or for worse, they saw his presidency as the answer to their troubles. Like Tracy says, it's who they wanted to win. And you know, I think the elephant in the room is some of the troubles are real, such as economic disempowerment, but some of them are not, such as a threat from Black and brown people. This is important for us to remember as a democracy, that we are a fairly young democracy. If you think about the true moment of us becoming a true constitutional democracy was the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So prior to that point, we had this widespread disenfranchisement, and the rule of law did not apply in the lives of so many of Americans, especially Black Americans. And then at this point in 2020 or 2021, the Voting Rights Act is nominally still in force, but key provisions have been weakened. And so the bottom line is that we don't actually have an affirmative right to vote in the United States. We only have reasons that people cannot be prohibited from voting. That's an important difference. So it's important for us to think about the fragility of the franchise in this country and the newness of real democracy in this country. And when you think about it that way, it's not so surprising that so many Americans were rooting for an undemocratic result.
I know someone who worked in the Capitol, who worked in the U.S. Senate Historical Office, which is outside of the Capitol, but inside the Capitol there were some displays, and two things that were destroyed on January 6th was a portrait of John Lewis and an exhibit on woman suffrage marking the centenary of it. Those two things were destroyed, which is more than symbolic, I think, to back up what you were saying, Anastasia.
Yeah,
wow.
I was, I think you're right on the nose here, Anastasia, to talk about the importance of suffrage in the 65 Voting Rights Act. But I guess what you're saying leads me maybe to disagree with you, Tracy, a little bit. I mean, maybe I have more time than both of you right now. I watched a lot of these interviews of these people who were inside the Capitol and read a lot of the stories about them. They really believed that this election was stolen. And part of that is social media and media channels, and I want to talk about that in a minute. But the larger part of it is, these urban areas with people who are Black and brown are voting, and that's not right. They shouldn't take away the presidency from real Americans. And I think that in some sense, there is a real underlying racism here that's, coded or very thinly coded in the story, and people really believe this.
Well, I think we actually agree. I mean, do they really think that there are machines that have been coded to not count certain votes with others, or is it just simply?
I mean, no, the language, right? So when they're saying the election's been stolen, it's the people who live in Detroit and Atlanta that they're afraid of that shouldn't be, deciding who's our president.
Because their votes are not legitimate.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Not because they actually won, but somehow the ballot boxes were not found or whatever the use was. I mean, it's nationwide, it's a 7 million vote margin. And for the vote to be stolen in the Electoral College, you need an unbelievable amount of coordination that nobody can detect in at least 3 states that aren't close to each other.
Right, but what they're objecting to is that urban people, votes were counted and they shouldn't be determining who's our president. So it was all focused on, Detroit and on Atlanta. And, and to go back to 2016, where Trump talks about, millions, there were more than 2 million illegal votes in California. He really won California, right? So he's talking about, in the language he used in 2016.
Right, Trump says he won the popular vote. So that's how you can take care of that. You don't expand your constituency. You don't build on your coalition. You don't think, how can I reach more people? You just make it up. That's usually not a path to success.
Yeah. So there was a question in the chat here that Anastasia said we're a young democracy. And the reason is because people were not, democracy means involves voting rights. And until 1965, we did not have those rights. Large portions of the American population were denied the right to vote over the course of American history. We were born as a republic, not as a democracy. And it's not through, it's through the 13th Amendment and through women's suffrage, and then ultimately the 1965 Voting Rights Act that people fully gained the right to vote. So let's move on and talk a little bit about social media and the press and the economics that underlies this. I mean, this is relatively new. Tracy might say it's not new because the press in the 19th century was very partisan, but this is a shift from the post-war American years of a more impartial press to this fractioning of the press, right? And the ability and social media to avoid the press altogether. So how does this feed into Trumpism? What do you think about this? What are your views on this?
Well, I can speak. I see I'm muted here. My response to the press is often similar to my response to frustrating papers from my students. There are some bad habits of communication in the press, in the mainstream press, that I think we need to take a look at. So some of those bad habits are both sidesism. That is the idea that there are bad things on both sides, and both sides have some good. Sometimes both sides are not parallel or congruent, and you can't do that. The media is very much afraid of being called liberally biased, and so the fear of liberal bias sends media executives to perhaps overcorrect the other way. Thoughtless shorthand. Sometimes there are ways of referring to events, trends that really do a disservice in terms of conveying the truth, and that they're habits of the press, the language that the press uses, but it actually is not accurate. And all of these things are balance and form valued over truth and function. So the truth should be the object of the press, and not balance. And I have to be very careful to say that this is not all of the press. And I think there's been a learning curve, and these things have gotten better. But these are some of the entrenched habits of the field that we're really dealing with. As for social media, we have, especially on Facebook, these famous algorithms that privilege outrage. We have billionaires in charge of the dissemination of information, and this big problem that misinformation gets the same weight, or sometimes more weight, than the truth. So those are some of the problems with media.
Yeah, as you might know, I've been teaching this course on misinformation, and one of the exercises is to take a conspiracy theory. I don't care if it's, the polio vaccine or the moon landing or anything associated with COVID. And I would have students go and find the conspiracy theory and then find either the scientific or something else to try to refute it. And almost always they would say that the conspiracy theory is a lot easier to find. And they had to do a lot of digging to try and get at the reality of the situation. So it's out there. And, at least one of the things I did, I got 2 students to get off social media last semester, which I thought was the greatest triumph of my life. I hope they're still off of it, but I bet they feel a lot better, after trying to get the information on their own. I mean, that's the whole point of a university, is to try and find the best available facts and not listen to what your friends are telling you necessarily on Facebook.
So, one of the best examples of this is the misinformation about vaccines and vaccines causing autism, right? So we know exactly where that started. The lawyer and doctors who conspired in Britain and were ultimately convicted and went to jail over this. And it was, to make money in a lawsuit. So the origins of this are really clear and have been adjudicated by court. And yet, the anti-vaccine movement continues to thrive through social media channels and across the world in interesting ways. So part of the story of American politics through the last 4 years is that Trump dominated the news cycle, right? He used these social media tools very effectively. And in the wake of what happened in the Capitol, Google and Amazon and Facebook turned around and said, no more, you can't use our tools anymore. What do you think about this? Is this, you're worried about threats to free speech? Do you think it's important to that corporations should police anti-democratic speech and truth like this?
Go ahead, Anastasia.
No, it's somewhat terrifying that corporations have this much power. In fact, in the abdication of some of these basic functions of government, corporations have stepped in. And the problem is that social media companies are private media companies. They can take or leave customers as they wish. They can turn things on and shut them off. And so, it's deeply problematic. I don't want our communications to be tied up in with a corporation that has a profit motive over the function of the corporation.
Yeah, I would agree. And of course, we have the marketplace of ideas, as John F. Kennedy called them, and that it's everybody's responsibility to try and weigh that information that you get. We're deluged with it. I know we're not supposed to be predicting the future. I doubt if those prohibitions are going to last that much longer from these places, or folks will find new outlets in one way or another. But I think it's the legal, the worries about legal consequences that has suddenly now entered into the situation. Now, I forgot the name of the voting company that has sued Giuliani and Sidney Powell. Now there are possibly some consequences for just saying whatever you want.
Well, I like what you said, Anastasia, there's sort of an abdication of political leadership here, right? So we've had a part of the story of not just the last 4 years, but, the last 10 years has been a Congress that has not been a Congress at all and has passed extraordinary little amount of legislation and hasn't dealt with challenges. For Tracy and I, at least in our generation, growing up in post-war America, there was a fairness doctrine, right? Congress legislated how media dealt with this through the political system, and there were courts then that you could be adjudicated under this, right? And so the fairness doctrine was repealed, and this is not, there's been no court rulings in this area whatsoever. So I think this is, for a functioning democracy, Congress has to work here and has to deal with this and set some rules on legality of speech and hold people accountable. All right, let's talk a little bit about probably the two biggest issues that were out there in the election, because I think that they affect the outcome and where we're going. So let's do the pandemic first. So the pandemic obviously posed an unprecedented challenge to democratic government, but we did it worse than anybody else in the world, and there's a striking failure. How do we understand this? How does, a democracy that, we've championed for so long as the way to make government work, turn out to be so ineffective and so unable to deal with this big health crisis?
I could start. I mean, I remember we talked about this last summer. And we talked about the fact that leadership matters. You need a coherent message, a national message that says, one, we have a problem. Two, here's what we can do. Three, there's a sense of empathy. The Wall Street Journal, which endorsed Trump later on, said, if he'd just shown a little bit of empathy, if he had talked about masks back in February and March, he would have won. Well, yeah, if he had been someone that he's not, yeah, he could have won. It's going to be hard for historians when they get to this to try and get their arms around the appalling reaction to this pandemic at so many levels that, I read today, where flight attendants are just scared to death because they're not wearing their masks. They don't feel like they have to. And so there has been a breakdown. There is no doubt. And so that, one of the great what ifs would have been, had the pandemic been controlled back in February, we hadn't had it, how would the election have turned out? I have a feeling Trump might have been reelected if it hadn't been for the pandemic, quite frankly. I have no evidence for it, but that's just my gut feeling.
I suspect the same thing, that really what it took the pandemic to show as many Americans as needed to vote, that Trump was not equipped to hold the office of the presidency. And I will say that the pandemic was my fear in 2016. So I was among those who was listening, not just to, not just talking about Trump as a sort of a character, but the anti-democratic impulses in his speech, and the, again, abdication of the national welfare really concerns me. And I think pandemic is what I was thinking would be Trump's nuclear moment. That is a moment of annihilation of a large segment of our population. And, I feared some repression, I feared some poverty, but it was the widespread death of a large number of Americans that I was very concerned about when he was elected, and which we have gotten, unfortunately. So that I think, unfortunately, more Americans have seen for themselves the consequences of that lack of leadership.
So, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, this has been an issue that it's not easy for any leader to solve, right? So even the countries that did the best had really, couldn't get rid of this and couldn't solve it by themselves. But say the contrast to Germany, Angela Merkel stepped down yesterday, and they've gone back and forth, but you see a functioning political system there in a way that our political system didn't function. Now, maybe this is, all fault of Trump, but I think a lot of, Congress didn't work either. The judicial system didn't work either, right? So we have judges ruling that you can't impose masks. There's sort of a political stalemate here that made this country, particularly badly prepared to deal with this. And we've, by percentage of the population, we've done the worst of anywhere in the world, and you never would have expected that.
I mean, this is this political legacy that we have from before the Civil War. We have a very difficult political reality, which is that racism can derail good government at any time. And so I think that if we don't have that long here, this is the conclusion that you might come to after a semester of me explaining Black history since 1865. But unfortunately what we have is the lack of democracy and the lack of political will for public welfare, and it has deep roots in racism. When an electorate can be so easily swayed by fears about their own fate, vis-a-vis those of people seen as the other, that is very unstable stand in which to root a democracy.
Yeah, so that's a good. Go ahead, Tracy.
Ronald Reagan said, what was it? The 9 scariest words in the English language are something like, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And that got a lot of good laughs back in the day. But since February, I don't think we've been saying that. We need government to work. We needed, who is, who's taking their stimulus checks outside and burning them because we don't want government help? Or, you know, it would have been great to have had someone just say, look, here's a mask. Here's how we're going to wear it. That's going to be your patriotic thing. That's what you can do. It doesn't take that much. And it doesn't take that much to show just a little bit of empathy for people who are struggling in so many ways. I mean, we all know this, but it was really kind of low-hanging fruit for an effective politician or a shrewd one or a deal-making businessman. And in reality, what a crisis does is it exposes and reveals people for who they really are.
Yeah, but I think you're also saying we've seen a you know, decline in Americans' faith of the positive role that government can play, right? So if you go back to the New Deal and you know, into the 1960s, there was a belief in government can make life better, and the concerted attack on that view for the last half century has come with a cost. Well, let's keep on the topic that Anastasia raised, because the other major political issue in this year was the Black Lives Matter protests, right, and the police violence. So how did that play out in the election? How did that change our political world, do you think? Well, I'll go first since I keep asking you and going last. I actually would emphasize what Anastasia said. I was trying to write it down, that racism can derail good government in this country. And I think that a lot of what got pointed out, that a lot of people woke up this summer to realize the depth and extent of racism and the violence that was portrayed on people who are Black and brown, and that I think has changed a lot of things. In the vote, it probably mobilized voters right and left, and both for Trump and for Biden. But I think in some sense it has changed the agenda for the Biden administration. It's striking to see the new administration talk about equity and talk about fighting racism on its first couple days in a way that the Obama administration never did. And because the Black Lives Matter movement really exposed things. I taught a class of 200 students this fall, and they read Ta-Nehisi Coates, and when they put themselves in the shoes of understanding what it's like to grow up young and grow up as a person of color and be afraid of the police in their country. And the vast range of students from the entire political spectrum felt that's not what America is supposed to be. And it was a really interesting experience.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the short answer of what I would say would be that it, on the one hand, mobilized millions of voters for Republicans and for Trump, but it also energized Democratic voters. I think that we're at a moment that it is an inflection point. It's a potential inflection point. Unless we have major policy results in public life, it won't be an inflection point. But ironically, as Mark was saying, Biden has a bit more of an opening than Obama did in terms of anti-racist policy. So Obama had to walk a very fine line. And I mean, I think we can all remember when he was criticized for calling the police officer in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who wouldn't let Henry Louis Gates into his house, stupid. He said his action was stupid, and that was a scandal that Obama said such a thing. How could he say something so divisive? And I think we are seeing some shift in the idea that it's worse to be racist than it is to falsely call somebody racist. For years, the opposite was the case. But we're on the cusp. It could be an inflection point, or it could not be, depending on what happens next.
Yeah, I would agree. Biden does have some opportunities. That's what a crisis sometimes does. And he's got a narrow window, but I tried to track this down. I think he is among the first, or if not the first, to use the actual term white supremacy, which angered some people. But you've got to kind of be blind not to see the reactions to peaceful protesters and to the insurrectionists and the differing reactions to that. I was struck by the way that peaceful protesters the day before the election in Alamance County, North Carolina, and nobody's talking about the vote in North Carolina and the means by which that was obtained, but some peaceful protesters were pepper sprayed, including a 6-year-old kid. The day before the election, they weren't armed. They weren't trying to storm the gates of the city hall, but they were. You should look at the photographs of these menacing people over them, and the clear message was there. And so you got to kind of be blind to the different reactions to this that have struck a lot of people who otherwise might have just ignored it or been living in denial. And that's a powerful concept as well.
So we've been going over an hour here. What historians make bad prognosticators. We leave that to the political scientists on another floor in our building. Nonetheless, where do we go from here? Where does this leave the country? What do you expect to happen with the Biden administration? What happens with Trumpism and the Republican Party moving forward? Any predictions we can hold you to the next time Karen wants to organize a panel?
Okay. What needs to happen? Biden is, I think, going to go big or go home. I am thinking that this is. In terms of, what we've already seen, as we're speaking, I think he's signing some executive orders that have to do with racial justice. So I'll just go out there and say that. But I'm also going to warn that we're not out of danger. And so I also predict that in seeing that Americans might withdraw from their concerns and vigilance about democracy and think that it might be getting taken care of. And so I see some more narrow contests in our future.
Okay, I'll actually try a few predictions, okay? So you can laugh at them here in the next few days. I don't think Trump is going to be convicted in the impeachment trial, but as historians, we know that there are unintended consequences, and that might not be a good thing for Trumpism. Because I remember, listen to me, Mark. I remember back when Nixon was pardoned by Gerald Ford. Even among his supporters, at least the ones I knew, there was a sense he got away with it, while a lot of his aides and assistants went to jail. And so if we start seeing throughout the spring and summer a number of people who participated in that insurrection sentenced to long federal sentences, and Trump is playing golf, that might not play well for Trumpism in looking at 2022. How's that for a prediction?
Pretty good.
Yeah. So I think leadership matters too, and I think that the presidency matters, and having a majority, even if it's a 50-50 Senate with the vice president voting, presents the opportunity for leadership to make a difference here. And so a big coronavirus relief bill, I think we'll get through Congress one way or another, and that can make a real difference in the politics here. Well, I want to give you each a chance for some final words. You know, we grow up in a system that talks about checks and balances. It's been very interesting to think about, you know, what stopped this insurrection. It seems to me, you know, we talk about three branches of government: Congress, the judiciary, and the presidency. In fact, Congress and the judiciary didn't do much to stop the danger that was going on in this country. But we did see some commitment to our institutions in other places. The military said no. They said no back when Trump tried to use them in the past, in the summer, and he was, you know, and that they remain committed to the democratic institutions. And ironically, the career civil servants in America said no, right? So the deep state, which Trump complained about, actually stood up for process. And that's, you know, the story of what happened in the, with the, you know, Attorney General and Trump trying to get the overturned the election results, and everybody in the justice, you know, all the civil servants in the Justice Department threatening to resign, and he backed off from it. So there was sort of, seemed to me, there was more commitment in the what are often seen as the less political branches of government to democracy than we saw it in among elected officials and judges who are appointed by elected officials.
Quickly, I know we don't have a lot of time. I'd say we're talking about the opportunities offered to Joe Biden. We haven't had someone who is as experienced and as knowledgeable about the inner workings, say, of legislation and of where the bodies are buried and how the process works, and loves it as much, maybe since Lyndon Johnson. And so he's kind of the anti-Trump in that way. He believes in the, you know, the foundations of government. If I'm going to do another prediction, I'd say I don't think the filibuster is going to go away. You know, and so it's going to be fascinating to see this 50-50 split as long as it lasts, but it actually gives each senator maybe even a little more power, that if there's something in a particular bill they don't like, they're willing to cross the aisle, that it could give them even more clout. So that's where we're going to be seeing here in the next few months.
I can make an easy prediction, which is there will be lots of discussion and disagreement within the Republican Party. That's easy because it's already happening. And there was a question earlier about Portman's retirement and some of these not very old, comparatively not very old senators retiring, and I think this has to do with their sense of the future of the party. I do think that there is a serious power struggle within the party right now. That it will be interesting to see how it plays out. Of course, I'm not going to predict how it is going to play out, because that would be making a real prediction, and I'm not going to do that.
Well, I think that, you know, if you go back to Tracy's point about what was the high water mark of Republican votes for president, you know, if the high water mark was 48%, you know, even if you have a small split in the party, the potential is there for a major shift in electoral realignment. This is a volatile time for electoral politics, and you know, it's clear that moderate or institutional Republicans fear being primaried from the right, and yet they're uncomfortable with what they're being asked to do. I mean, it was pretty striking that the only Kentucky congressman who voted for the to investigate the election was Hal Rogers, who's seen as a more moderate institutional Republican and was thus vulnerable from the right. And whereas, you know, someone like Andy Barr, who's not going to be primaried from the right, did not vote to do that. So it's the Republican Party is in some really serious challenges right now. Tracy, do you have more predictions, or that's your list?
Well, I don't think there will be a third party. I saw that there was discussions of Trump trying to form a third party. I think he better think twice about that. I don't know about you, but first of all, that would require real work, real organizing, and might want to think about that. But I think both parties are having kind of a defining moment. And so, even though Democrats control Congress, it's razor thin. It can change. The Senate could change with one senator getting sick, having to resign for something. I also think, okay, I'll give you one more prediction. I think Biden is going to have a Supreme Court nomination to make soon. I think I need my own talk show. I mean, predictions for the night, right? But I think pressure will be on Justice Breyer to think about this as an opportunity and to step aside.
I agree.
Any final words? Anastasia?
I don't know about any more predictions, but I do have some words of wisdom, which is that, just as racism can derail democracy, anti-racism can help democracy. And, listening to Black people and Black Americans listening to Black people would have perhaps not had us get into the situation with COVID and this crisis of government legitimacy and foreign interference and criminality. If we had listened to Black people, we might not be in this situation. And especially Black women, we're pragmatic voters, and our self-interest actually aligns with the interest of most Americans, because we believe that democracy really is a path to self-determination. Black people are canaries in the coal mine, and I think that our perspective really is an archetypal one for the American polity. So listen to Black people.
So I would really agree with that. I mean, you always think back to the 1920s. You see immigration restriction and a resumption of white supremacy at a moment when American population had really changed forever because of immigration. And America today is America's going to become a more diverse country every year moving forward. Peoples from all over the world, more peoples of color, that sets the agenda that we really need to move beyond racism and address it, and we need political leadership to do that. So I think it's really exciting to see Biden willing to put that up there with climate change and the coronavirus, and understanding how important that is for the future of democracy in this country.
Very quickly, when a lot of this was happening, I kept thinking about a conversation Lyndon Johnson had with George Wallace when they were discussing school integration and Wallace wouldn't move. And Lyndon finally said, George, there's going to be a monument to you one day. Do you want to say George Wallace he built, or George Wallace he hated? And I was thinking about that a lot, really, in the aftermath of the 2020 election.
All right, Karen, I'll turn it over to you to finish up.
So I want to thank everybody for a very stimulating conversation. Thank you so much. It was really fascinating. And I think there's, a lot of hunger for this kind of conversation. And so indeed, maybe we will have you all back periodically to check in and see what's going on. I want to thank our audience for their comments, for their questions, and for attending our panel. Thank you so much. And this will be available on video reproduction in a few days on the CHSS website. Please check out the CHSS website for other events this spring. And thank you all. Have a great day.